Right, good morning everybody. Welcome to the CQC Public Board meeting. A particular welcome to those of you who have come from the public to be with us today. We have one apology for absence, as most of the board will know. David Byrne's father died at the beginning of the week, and David is in the north of England making the relevant arrangements, so sends his apologies. And I'm sure the whole board would want to send their condolences to David and his family, which we do. Other than that, we have no apologies for absence. Are there any declarations of interest anybody needs to make before we get into the agenda? Very good. We've got two matters arising on the action log which are being progressed. Is there any other matter arising anybody wanted to raise coming out of the minutes of the last meeting? Okay, so that takes us to David's report, which we will deal with without David. Just in terms of the first item, the performance report in relation to the inspection programme, I think all I would want to do is just to again congratulate all our colleagues on the progress that's been made and the delivery of our programmes on time, which is really good. The next item is around inspection report timeliness, which we know is one of the issues that we really are trying to grapple with. And perhaps I could just ask each of the chief inspectors in turn just to update the board on where we are in relation to each of their areas. So, Andrea, can I come first to you since it's first on the list here?
Thank you. So, as you'll see, we kept the key performance indicator target for adult social care at 90% for completion within 50 days throughout the year, and we have been making steady progress towards that target, and also ensuring that the average numbers of days that it's taking us to complete reports was dropping. There's a slight increase towards the end of the programme, which is probably accounted for by the amount of time that people were taking to complete the inspections and then finish the report. So we're keeping on top of that in terms of management. In terms of trying to make sure that we continue to improve, we're doing a number of things. So we have been looking at the reports that we are writing for those services that we are going back to, which remain good, and trying to ensure that we're focusing the writing of those reports in a way that makes it much more effective and efficient for the inspectors to complete them quickly. Secondly, we are also looking at one of the aspects of how this is impacted on. Within the 50 days that we have, there are 10 days that are allowed for factual accuracy from the providers. And very often that can be a bit of a to and a fro in terms of requesting additional information from the inspector and how they deal with that. So we provided guidance to our inspectors to help them in dealing with some of those situations so that they can deal with them in a much more effective and efficient manner. And last but not least, we're obviously using and really pay tribute to the team in sector support who have been helping us with the management information on this, looking at tracking through the dates that we've got for the completion of the reports. So we're flagging up to inspectors and to their managers much earlier in the process where it looks like there's the potential that it's going to go off track. And that's been very helpful in terms of making sure that from a performance management point of view, we're picking up on that. But also if there are issues around providing people with extra support to ensure that they can complete the reports on time, that they can do that. So there are a variety of different reasons why reports may not be done in the timeliness that we would expect, and we're trying to take a variety of different approaches to address them.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. Steve, PMS.
Thank you, Peter. We've been taking this as one of our top priorities. The priority, obviously, that was absolutely top was to complete the programmes. And when we look at PMS here, PMS is a composite of the general practice programme, which we completed on time in January, and dentistry, which has a different completion date, April. We finished that 2 weeks early. We completed the GP programme with a lot of bank input, and we've had some sickness. So we do have internal variation on performance, where the North region, which has got the lowest sickness rate and the most stable numbers of staff. In fact, we've over-recruited slightly in North compared with some of the other areas, are actually within the KPI. Whereas London, which had the slowest time to get the numbers of inspectors to an acceptable level and has had more sickness, is way below. And so we're putting extra support and help into trying to address the variation between the regions, because the figures in two of the regions are unacceptable. And we spent a lot of time on Monday afternoon again at our performance meeting, looking at lean principles and how we can smooth out some of the problems. One of the problems we're reporting is it's an accumulative total, and therefore we've had problems for quite some time which don't drop off the radar, if you know what I mean. So it's really difficult to get to the KPI once you've started with problems, and in the areas with the worst performance and sickness, that's where we've got additive problems now, and so we're trying to address it on a individual inspector and team basis. If we can address the internal variation, we can bring up the performance. So I can assure you we're onto it, as we have been for the last 3 years, but it's really, really difficult.
Sorry, go on, Andrea.
There was one other point that I meant to mention, which actually affects, and the reason why I remembered was because it affects PMS as well as it affecting adult social care, is that there is one slight little issue that we've got with the presentation of the data, which we've identified and the team are addressing, but has not been corrected for this report, which is that when we undertake enforcement action, as the board is aware, we're unable to share that enforcement action in the reports and with the general public until it's been completed. When that happens, we reissue the report with the enforcement action included in the report. And the logic of the presentation at the moment takes that second date as the date by which we judge it. So there's two problems with that. One, it double counts it because we'll see it in the first time. And then secondly, when we reissue the report, it will take the date that it's been reissued compared to the inspection undertaken, and that will inevitably be after 50 days, and in some cases quite considerably after 50 days. So that will raise the average numbers of days, and also it's only about 3 or 4%, but it will make a difference to the key performance indicator target completion. So that's something that we've identified. The team are addressing that in terms of the logic model. I'm not quite sure when that will change in terms of the presentation of the report. So these figures are understated just a little bit, just so that the board is aware.
I think it's great that there's a lot of action going on. I mean, notwithstanding the data, I mean, probably the single biggest complaint that I get when I talk to providers is the delay in getting the reports. I mean, this is important, but we're taking the actions, and as we've also discussed in other parts of the meeting, the real quantum leap will be when we've gone through our digital transformation. So these are important things that we can do at the moment. There's something beyond that. Mike, hospitals.
Thank you, Peter. Much the same picture. We're giving this very high priority. As Steve was saying, in terms of dealing with backlogs, we had a big onslaught on a backlog at the end of last year, and therefore published in Q4. So actually our Q4 figure, of course, looks worse because they had already breached by the time we were doing that backlog. But I think what we are doing is, firstly, we are setting intermediate performance indicators within the Directorate for when the first draft should be available from each of the core services, the inspectors writing those, when they should get to our quality assurance panels, etc., so that we are very actively tracking it, I think, as Andrea was saying, and also making sure that inspectors timetable themselves to have time to do that writing immediately after an inspection rather than immediately going out on another one. What we can say is that in terms of the median and mean times for reports coming out, there are very, very considerable improvements. I've got the graphs here if you would like to see them. But, for example, on mental health, where a year or two ago we were averaging 100 days, that's down now to averaging just over 40 days. So that means that we are getting to the point where we should be able to get a major improvement.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. So moving on, enforcement. Rebecca, do you just want to report where we are on enforcement?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So in relation to enforcement, in the 12 months running up to January 2017, we have 1,775 published enforcement actions. A published enforcement action, just going back to Andrew's explanation of the previous figures, means an enforcement action which has concluded, and that means conclusion of any appeal. In addition to that, we have 1,187 enforcement actions in progress, so that's where they haven't concluded, which does include appeal proceedings. And out of those enforcement actions, the majority in all sectors is a warning notice, with 87% for hospitals, 76% for adult social care and 54% in PMS. We have 538 locations in special measures, and those are shown in terms of their movements in the quarterly report.
Thank you. Kate, our financial position?
Thanks, Peter. So as at the end of February, our forecast outturn stood at 15.6 million underspent. That is made up of 6.1 million on pay, which is largely driven by customer and corporate services, strategy and intelligence and hospitals. Non-pay is forecast to be 9.4 million underspent. Again, main drivers, customer and corporate services, strategy and intelligence and hospitals. The main drivers for the non-pay have been changes in behaviour and awareness, increased budgetary control. We've had much improved contracts which have driven out value from third-party contracts and suppliers. And we've had a real improvement in the cost of travel and accommodation, which has been facilitated by improvements in the IT and estates infrastructure. So the end-of-year position is still being worked through, but I think we can safely say that this will be the first year that we have spent less than we did the previous year since CQC set out.
Which is great, and is very positive for the future as well in terms of the changes that you've made, the efficiencies, because they will carry on into the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really, really good. Steve, I think on the update from you, we'll take that on in item 5, yeah, because that's, I think your update is all around the digital providers. Mike, do you want to say anything about two trusts that we put back into special measures?
No, just to report that these are the first two trusts that have had to go back into special measures, North Lincolnshire and Goole and United Lincolnshire Hospitals Trust, and we are working on these very closely with our colleagues at NHS Improvement on what needs to be done to turn them back round again.
Okay, thank you. Following the budget and the additional money that was awarded in the budget for adult social care, we expect to be asked by the Secretary of State to do some work. As of today's meeting, we are still waiting the letter from the Secretary of State to confirm that, so we watch this space. A number of things get held up by PERDA, which I will perhaps take. That's sort of under item 9 on the report, but let me just take all of them because it's an inevitable inconvenience to our well-ordered, well-oiled machine that certain things that we'd programmed at certain times are now going to have to get delayed. Probably those with the biggest impact to the sort of outside world are our various consultations. So we had been due to publish the response to the next phase consultation that closed back in February. That we will now publish immediately or as soon after the election as is possible. Similarly, we were due to publish a new consultation at this stage, which would be the sort of the further next phase, and that again will have to wait until after the election. So both those will be published as soon as practical after the election. We then had a third consultation, and that's going to have to now slot in early autumn, and at this stage it's too early to be precise as to what the date will be around that. There are some other consequences, all of which are perfectly manageable, but for example we have a couple of vacancies on the board, non-executive director vacancies. We were about to advertise for those. That's now put on hold until after the election. We then run into the summer holidays, so the reality is that the appointments that we had hoped to be able to make probably towards the end of July will now probably be towards the end of September or even into October. So it's an inconvenience but not a disaster. There are various other things which are probably not worth mentioning now, but they are all obvious in terms of just manageable delay. I skipped over the prescribed persons, which relates to whistleblowing and our the new data reporting. Yeah, Rebecca, can I just ask, because I'm a little unclear myself, is there a very carefully defined definition of whistleblower for this purpose?
Yes. What this relates to is prescribed persons under PEDA or specifically those with rights to make a claim under the Employment Rights Act where they have suffered a detriment because of whistleblowing. So the definition of these prescribed persons that we're talking about here are those that fall into the criteria under the Act. There's a number of heads that you might fall under, but basically you have to be making the disclosure in the public interest, and it could be because you think there's been a criminal offence, a failure to follow a legal obligation, a miscarriage of justice, or actually for our purposes, most people who come to us will be doing so because they think that the health or safety of an individual has been endangered. There are other criteria, but they're probably not relevant to CQC.
Thank you. So let me just pause there before we come on to the performance dashboard. Colleagues want to raise points? Robert, please.
Maybe Rebecca can help. I must admit I've not looked at these regulations yet, but knowing that whether someone is or is not a whistleblower occupies the time of an employment tribunal forever, and there are all sorts of results that come out, some of which are potentially surprising. And therefore, what I'm saying is whether someone comes within the definition is controversial, or can be. How do we? What is our obligation in relation to reporting? If someone claims to be blowing a whistle and has told, is that something which we will report about? Because it seems to be important we aren't sort of making the sort of assessment that an employment tribunal makes, because otherwise we won't actually have a measure of what's going on, as it were. Sorry if that sounds a bit unclear, but without going into the legal definitions, that's as best I can do.
You're right that it's complicated, and ultimately that this is something the tribunal will determine. Obviously, at the point people come to us, they may or may not have gone to a tribunal. So I think, for our purposes, we will go on what they are declaring.
Questions for the Chief Inspectors. About two external developments. Since we last met, there was a publication on care homes by the Independent Age organisation, and that was it had quite a lot of relevant findings. In fact, it used our data, so it's not surprising they were relevant. But among many findings, one of them was that one of the most newsworthy, it turned out, was the geographical variation in the ratings of care homes. I felt very strongly about it because the North West did so badly. In fact, Greater Manchester did pretty badly. And I just wondered whether that's something we should or could be investigating more and perhaps reporting on more in the way that we report progress into the next phase. And if I could just briefly on a completely different subject, the other topic relevant to our previous work is the concern over maternity services in Shrewsbury and Telford. And I just perhaps get a perspective from Mike on the investigation that's been ordered into that service. I suppose for those of us who've been around this table for a couple of years, there was an unsettling familiarity with the themes of Morecambe Bay. Whether or not that will turn out to be correct, I don't know, but that's certainly a lot of the way that it was reported. And it was a little bit surprising to find that so many of the themes there were, because these are recent, if there are problems, there are recent problems, and they've played out since the Morecambe Bay became highly publicised. So just your reflections on the investigation, Mike.
Andrea first.
On the independent age report, that yes, they used our data extensively to create that analysis. We have tended to use the analysis on a kind of local basis for a couple of purposes. One, in presenting information to local authorities. So we have kind of provided information in conversations with our partners, both from a commissioning and a safeguarding perspective in local authorities. So the liaison that my team do there. And we've also traditionally kind of presented the information by the 9 government areas, so we've kind of seen the picture across the country. It was a very interesting analysis that the Independent Age did. Yes, it showed that the North West was not doing quite so well, but there were other pockets. There wasn't quite the north-south divide that people were claiming. There are other pockets of problematic areas in the south as well as across the Midlands too. So two things that we are thinking of doing in terms of presenting this information more broadly. The first is that much as Mike did in terms of the end of the first stage of hospital inspections, we're going to have a roundup of our findings from the first phase of adult social care inspections, and the data analysis is being done at the moment, and we will look at what's the appropriate geographical level to do that, and secondly we'll think about that in terms of the work that we'll do for the state of care report as well. So trying to represent that information in that way. But I think that the critical thing is what's happening at a local level and the conversations that we're having with commissioners as well as with providers about what's driving that variation at a local level and what can people do about it.
In terms of Shrewsbury and Telford, we are working obviously very closely with NHS Improvement and NHS England in terms of the investigation, although they are leading it. My understanding is that at least the first step in that is that they've formed a panel which will meet in May, and they will be reviewing all the investigations and reports that have been done into baby deaths. The original sort of index case goes back as far as 2009, but as you say, several other baby deaths have been more recent. My understanding is that Shrewsbury and Telford is not a statistical outlier in that way, but that does not mean there aren't things to be learned, and we will certainly want to learn from that. We have recently undertaken an inspection of Shrewsbury and Telford. The report is not through yet, so I can't comment on that, except to say that we did ensure that our National Professional Advisor for Maternity Services was part of the inspection team.
Good. Any other questions from the board on the written report? Should we move on to the performance dashboard? I had a slight concern looking at the dashboard with my magnifying glass, because it's quite hard to see otherwise. It would appear that there are some re-inspections of inadequate providers that are behind schedule, that are outstanding. And that worried me. So I don't know whether, A, I've read this right, and B, if I have, what it is that we're doing about it. Andrew, do you want to?
Thank you very much, and grateful that you identified that to me before the meeting, so I was able to follow up. And we've looked at both the inadequate overdue inspections and the requires improvement overdue inspections. And looking at each of those records, and again, there's a variety of reasons of why this has happened. And so, yes, the presentation of the information is there, but some of those services have closed, and it's just not kind of fed through in terms of the information in our database. So we need to kind of check up why that is and what we're doing there. Others have actually had a focused inspection, which has led to a change in the rating. And again, there's just something about the logic of how we're sort of driving that through and where we start the count in terms of when we'll go back and do the inspection. There are some others who have had actually had a comprehensive inspection, but it's been recorded as a focused inspection. So it's not actually, it's showing up as overdue when it's actually been undertaken. So we need to check and sort that out. There are a couple of services where we would have been going back, but they were dormant. So this is largely in domiciliary care. They were dormant, and so we didn't go back because there wouldn't be anything to inspect, but actually they've now reactivated. And so they've reactivated, and obviously the kind of dating goes back to the original inspection, so that makes it look overdue, even though there was a completely reasonable decision not to inspect at that stage because there wasn't anything to inspect. And there are also a few services where the inspection had been scheduled and would have been appropriately on time, but had to be rescheduled because of priority risks in other services and just the moving around of inspectors, and in one particular instance, the specialist support that we needed for the inspection. And in terms of this being the cut-off date of this activity, some of the inspections have now already happened since the data was produced. What's been very useful, and the team get weekly reports identifying how we're doing in terms of the comparison to when we've said that we would inspect services, and so they're kind of looking at that, and it's fed through into the individual inspectors' portfolios. But what this has identified is that there are a variety of things that we need to do, both in terms of making sure that we're managing risk across the portfolio of both inspectors and teams and services, so that an individual inspector who's got, lots of risky services and lots that they should be going back to, actually, we're not expecting them to do all of that. They get support from other members of the team, and we've introduced new ways of working since the 1st of April to enable that to happen much more flexibly. And secondly, there are clearly some data issues which may be about the way that we're recording things, not the way that it's being presented, but the way that we're recording things and the logic of how that then is presented. So we will be addressing that back with the sector support team.
So the risk of putting lots of words in your mouth, what I think you're saying is that with the exception of a small number which may have been very slightly delayed because of a reprioritisation, those services that need to be re-inspected have been re-inspected.
In the main, they have. Not absolutely every single one of them has, but in the main that they have. And so, actually, in terms of the level of risk, it's not as kind of big as it looks. But we need to be on top of it, and we need to be using the management information that we've got to make sure that we're going back to the places that we need to be going back to. And this is a shift for all of us, really, in terms of the way that we're scheduling inspections now. It's not just we've got to complete a programme by doing all services by this date. It is we've got to go back to inadequates within 6 months, requires improvement within 12, etc., and newly registered services within 12 months, and making sure that we're actually proactively managing our management information and our delivery against those targets, as opposed to what we were doing in the last financial year.
Thank you. Steve, the dashboard would suggest you've got a similar situation. The answer's similar.
But, I think Andrea gave an excellent answer, actually. I would add a couple of points. One is it does include on the data some of those that are inadequate that we've re-inspected and are remaining inadequate, and it's about risk management of those, particularly those in special measures. Some of those will include, these are just GP surgeries and urgent care, those that are about to be taken over or merged by other organisations or are dormant. So, that's the only addition to Andrea's point. But we are moving in a different way now. So we're going to be looking at formally scheduling with a date in the diary for 6 months and 1 year, rather than waiting just for the inspector to prioritise that in their portfolio. So we're trying to be a little bit more lean about it as well going forward. But again, it comes down to risk management and prioritisation locally.
Yes, Liz, please. No, go on. No, I was going to ask.
It's on the same point.
Yeah.
It's a good point. And Andrew, you said something very positive there about, I think, which I agree with, about the changing nature of our role in a way. So there's been this comprehensive round of inspections, and now we've got a set of findings. And I hesitate to ask for more information in this dashboard because it's quite data heavy. But this probably has moved to being one of our main concerns now, I would say, whereas initially we were adding up the numbers. Now I think we need to see the progress and the trajectory. And that partly means, I think, the plan for re-inspection, the point you're making, and the change in, I suppose, we'd like to see the numbers going down, of course, and also the time that people have been in their current situation. So just to illustrate, we've got, 538 organisations in special measures, 398 of them are in social care. And we've had the conversation before about what exactly special measures means in social care, but it does mean, what it definitely means is that there are thousands, I don't know how many thousands, of people who are getting their care home care in an organisation that is under special measures. And I think that we need to be looking at how long that's been going on. So how long have they been in special measures, and what's the planned action? So this is by way of supporting what I think you were suggesting. But I wonder whether we could have it as data here. And if it's difficult to do it monthly, because it might be, then at least at regular intervals, so that we can see the dynamic situation changing.
And just to say, because obviously this is reporting on last year's data, and Malta's team in performance and planning is already looking at what should the dashboard look like for the future on the basis of, it's not a comprehensive programme that we're seeking to finish. It is actually essentially managing risk and also spotting where improvement could be happening, so that we're going back and identifying that and being able to inspect and report on that as well. So I think that there will be, we've got a discussion planned at ET next week, sometime soon anyway, as to exactly how that will look, so that we can make sure that we're kind of reporting much more with a different set of information for you, so we get to the heart of what it is that you're saying, which I would completely agree with.
Good, thanks. I should have said, most of the data on the dashboard, and it is very data rich, is very encouraging, so I apologise for picking out the bits that concern me. But the other bit that concerned me, Steve, was on safeguarding. It would appear we're behind our KPIs in hospitals for both and in PMS and hospitals for concerns. I don't know if that's a data issue again, or whether there is a real problem, but it's slightly alarming when I looked at it.
Thanks. Thank you. So this is a new way of reporting, and it does. The number, obviously, if you look at the chart, varies enormously across the three directorates. And in adult social care, where their performance is excellent, if you think about the volume of both concerns and alerts. It's business as usual there. In PMS, it's very different, because the serious alerts we sort straight away. The very few concerns that we get, just like in general medical practice, it's how do you identify the new cancer? It's very difficult when they're they're rare occurrences for the number of inspectors we've got. And so we've got to improve our systems in order to respond quicker. Part of the issue has been a temporary blip in the changes in SCS. About 50% of the concerns going to PMS are not real safeguarding concerns. Of those 50%, we should do better. And so what we're doing within PMS is, having now taken on the business support team, they are going to be trained to do a daily report of outstanding queries and report directly to the inspector, because this hasn't been as high a priority to the inspectors as it should have been. And so what we've done in PMS is changed the system, so we should start to see an improvement now, because I believe it's unacceptable at the moment. The other thing I would say is that Ursula Gallagher has taken over the CQC responsibility for safeguarding now, and this is the first time we've reported following her change in leadership, and she's been burrowing down into the data and into the systems to see how we can improve across CQC. And I think we'll start to see an improvement in the next few months.
Thanks. I share your general concern, Steve. This is worrying when it's talking about safeguarding alerts. So whether it's next month or Ursula needs a little longer, I think it would be good if we could have a report back as to how much of this is data, how much of this is a real problem, and to the extent it's a real problem, what have we done about it?
Yeah, it's a whole system issue, yeah. And we'll do that.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else anybody wants to raise on the... Yes, Robert.
People. 5% sickness in adult social care? Is that, it's got a yellow, but seems to be converted into numbers. That's an alarming number of people. Is that something of concern, or is that within a normal sort of benchmark?
So it is an issue of concern, and it's something that we are monitoring. One of the issues for us in adult social care, as compared to the other directorates, is that our age profile is older compared to the age profile of the other directorates, and you know, the older people are, including myself, the older people are, there is a correlation to the higher level of sickness. So that's something that we are aware of and providing appropriate support. Second part of this issue is that within those figures there's quite a significant number of long-term sickness, both in terms of kind of limited things that people are having, and we know that they're going to come back, but also some very serious diagnoses for people, very sadly, which means that they've been off for quite some period of time. And an issue which I have shared with the People Director, Ruth Bailey, is the support that we've had from occupational health has not been as good as we would want it to be in terms of timely responses and support. And on occasions that has also meant that we've had a delay in being able to support people back into work because we've not been able to have an assessment from occupational health in a timely fashion. So there's a variety of issues there. And the last but not least one is around supporting people with mental health problems and sickness caused by stress and anxiety. And we do monitor that specifically. Sometimes that's obviously to do with work, workload pressures. Very often it's to do with other situations that people are facing. But we've done a tremendous amount of work across the CQC around supporting both members of staff to be more open about their mental health problems and to be able to have those discussions so they can have proactive support from their managers. And secondly, through the good offices of both Eileen's team and Mike's team in the Mental Health Hospitals Directorate, have been rolling out mental health awareness training for all managers so that they can actually support their staff in a much, much better way. And, so that's another way that we're trying to handle this. I mean, I've kind of answered that more broadly on a CQC basis, but it is a specific issue for us in adult social care, but it is something that we're trying to address across the board.
Thank you. Paul.
Thank you, Peter. Just one, almost completing things on productivity, where there's some interesting changes between January and February. I'm assuming that the move from being 130% productivity in PMS in January down to, was it 70-something in February, is all to do with actually completing the inspection, the push to get the inspections completed by the end of January. But it wasn't that people weren't doing any work in February, it's just that they were doing other things around reports and things like that. Is that the case? Same for ASC.
On contrary, they were working very hard in February. Yeah. Also on the digital work, completing the dental programme. But yes, it was an artificial push to get the reports through. Now it's about report writing as well as inspecting. But I think board should understand that the amount of work our inspectors are doing now is actually equal to what it was before. It's just more varied.
And also the productivity is measuring specific inspections. All of our inspection teams are doing other things as well, and particularly in terms of the reports. And February will have a slight dip because of the half-term holidays, and we would have had higher levels of annual leave absence during that month as well. And there's only 28 days.
So I think we should just recognise that there are some issues that have come out of the dashboard, and that's why we have the dashboard. It highlights them. That's great. But there's also an awful lot of very, very good data in here, good news data, and just congratulations to everybody who's worked to produce these results, because they are overall extremely good. So we're happy to move on to the next. Oh, look at that! Didn't even come in. Must be a magic button somewhere that just on time. So, Steve, why don't you introduce digital primary care, introduce Amanda and James, and go from there.
Thank you. People will have met or heard from James and Amanda. James is one of our national clinical leadership fellows here at CQC, part of the programme which also involves NICE and NHS England and other organisations. And he has been, during his year here, working very closely with our teams on the online stroke digital provision of healthcare, and has been doing brilliantly well. Amanda is the lead for PMS and community care for policy in Malta's directorate, and we would have had Ruth Rankin here, who's my deputy, who leads on this area, but she's away today. This is an example of CQC working across directorate, I think, exceedingly effectively on identifying a risk, putting a team together to risk stratify the risk across the providers, and then to go and review and inspect providers. And the report is there for everyone to read, and we're very happy to take questions. But to say that we have already inspected 15 providers of services which largely provide medicines online, of which we have taken some form of enforcement action on each of them. Of a total number of providers that we currently have registered is 46, and we will be completing the inspections of those services by August. So I think it's probably worth just pausing there. James and Amanda are here to help with answering the difficult questions, and over to you.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Paul.
Yeah, I guess there's a conundrum here, because what we're seeing is a more modern way that people are seeking to use the internet to get their medicines, and in a lot of areas of life, the internet has provided a really welcome improvement to what people can get in terms of services. But this seems to be indicating that in this particular area we have significant concerns. I guess what I was wanting to get to is, are we, in looking at from a risk perspective at those we see as riskiest first, are we expecting there to be also good examples of the prescription internet medicines as well coming out of our reports, or is this just generally a really difficult area? And if so, what are the lessons that we need to learn?
So I think the first thing I would say is that we, as CQC, support innovation and recognise that this sort of activity will be an important part of the health provision within England going forward. And what we're not seeking to do is prevent innovation and the implementation of these good ideas across the health system. And we're working closely with NHS England and other regulators and commissioners. We would really love to find some really good examples of care, and we hope that within those 46 we will. And we hope that by publishing our guidance, not just for providers but also for patients, that those that are about to be inspected will be learning. And this isn't about being punitive for the sake of being punitive. It's about protecting patients to make sure they get safe, effective care. Because clearly, from a responsive point of view, patients are saying that they would like access to these form of services. But we would expect that these services are providing the same safe care you would expect from a good and outstanding general medical practice anywhere in England, and therefore the standards are explicit and are fair for everybody to see. It's very sad that in those first 13 that we've gone to, They've included services that we've had to cancel their registration, as well as suspend others as well. And we only take that serious level of enforcement action when we need to. But we will not fear from doing that when we have to protect patients.
Steve, we've talked about this a lot. I mean, there doesn't seem to me to be any inherent reason why a new delivery mechanism, if I can call it that, should necessarily not be safe. Two things need to happen. One is the things that you would normally have in a bricks and mortar, if I can call it that, provision need to be in place. And I think what you found in some of the services you've inspected, that even those basics aren't in place. And then secondly, there are some additional things you need to have in place because you haven't actually got the patient in front of you when you're doing this, and those haven't always been there. But they don't seem to me to be things that are completely insurmountable. And to your point, Steve, if you can get those in place so that it's safe, then these new delivery mechanisms are the sorts of things that sections of the population, at any rate, will find very, very valuable.
I mean, I personally believe this will be a core part of the offer in primary care going forward. And part of our remit as CQC is to encourage improvement. And if that's the outcome and it's a more joined-up service, some of the basics, including identification of the patient in front of you, are things that you would expect in any service anywhere in the country. We're not asking for anything which is extraordinary.
Sorry, Kate. No. Sorry, I thought you were signaling me, Robert. Then.
I'm glad to see that. Well, firstly, the work that's being done in this area, I think, is tremendous and of great benefit potentially to the public. I'm glad to see what your work is including system-wide collaboration, because one of the things that would concern me is whether there are gaps in the regulatory system through which patients in particular can fall in terms of protection, and I suspect there's some very big gaps. In one sense, we can only regulate what we're allowed to regulate, but are we, do you think, doing enough to highlight the difference to the public, the difference in terms of protection between going to a regulated service and one which is not?
I think we've just begun that journey, really. I don't know, James, you're at the heart of all of this.
Yeah, I guess.
Press the red button.
So we are taking steps to work at a national level to look at the wider regulatory landscape, both through contact directly with the Department of Health, but also working with the National Quality Board. And the final component of that is we're going to be holding a round table with the other 4 nation regulators to look at the wider landscape throughout the UK. As our remit applies to England, there are other quality regulators in the rest of the UK, and so collaboration between them as well is essential.
But I think Robert's point, James, was that the best will in the world, people can set up an English-looking provider online from anywhere in the world, and there's nothing in this modern age that you can do to stop that happening. So it's really important that people understand that using those services that are not regulated are or potentially dangerous. And therefore, the safe thing to do is to only use a service that's been regulated. I think that was the point you were
correct,
you were
and that's why
trying to make.
we've really just started on that journey, and we need to do more generally about CQC regulation, I think, and promoting the ratings to the public across adult social care hospitals and general practice. This is going to be a really big issue going forward, not just for what we're seeing at the moment, which is the online consultation and prescribing of medication. Some of the providers will be providing online consultations by video. Some of those are likely to be NHS providers as well as private providers. And then we're starting to get into artificial intelligence and machine diagnosis, of which, of course, without humans being involved, we're not in scope for regulation. We've also got problems with services which are based, as you said, Chair, offshore, but also those based onshore serving patients offshore. So it's hugely complex, and James and Amanda were very much involved in a National Quality Board seminar the other day where leaders from NHS England and the other regulators, including MHRA, which we're working very, very closely with, were present and have committed to take this forward in a very joined-up way, which was reassuring.
Thank you. I think that, well, just in summary, thank you all three of you very much for what you're doing. This is really, really important, and the pace and the rigour with which you're pursuing this is very much appreciated. So thank you, and we will see you again. Great, good, thanks. So we will move on to our own effectiveness. We had a review from Deloitte. I'm not suggesting we have a long discussion about it this morning. If you go to the executive summary, it says we've noted a number of areas of strength in relation to the current board. In particular, we found board members to be of a high calibre and highly engaged. Overall, we are of the view that CQC board is an effective board. With a small number of changes to how it operates, it could become even more effective. And when Deloitte were taking me through the report, they used slightly different words to say that. They said these recommendations are about turning a good board into a great board. So I think we have an aspiration to be a great board, so we need to take these recommendations on board seriously. As I said earlier in the meeting, the election and purdah surrounding it means there will be a delay in filling the vacancies that we have on the board. And what I would propose to the board is that when we have got those new appointments made, we have a discussion about how we take the recommendations forward, and particularly the recommendations around board development. Is that acceptable to everybody? And meanwhile, we'll note the report and move on. Good. Paul, the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee, you're going to say a few words?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, just a very few words. This was very much a working meeting on the 5th of April. A lot of the work was about getting us up to speed, or bringing us right up to date with things which needed to be looked at ahead of the year-end processes, which will be looked at the next ACGC meeting next month. So things like looking at the internal audit reports which have been produced in the last period before since the last meeting, etc., etc. The one thing I think that we spent quite a bit of time on was the management assurance process, which had been the second of those that took place last year. And this was, I think, it's been going for two to 3 years, this management assurance process. And I think there were a couple of things to note. One was that the ratings that we're getting out of that management assurance process are improving. There are many more good than there were originally. The committee probed to make sure we weren't getting grade inflation in there, and we were reassured by the fact that there is a degree of scrutiny coming through, internal audit coming through, peer reviews coming through, ET challenge actually at each other in that respect, which I think means that the culture of being honest with ourselves still pertains in that respect. So I think that's a powerful tool which we've got there, more powerful perhaps than we realised at the beginning. And we need to keep it that powerful going forward as well. There are still things to be improved in there, and there are challenges which have been set down for people. But that's an encouraging bit. We looked at the risk register. I think I'll probably come back to the board at a later stage, but we gave some input into that. Internal audit, the progress is good, but there are still a number of audits which need to be completed and issued. They should get completed before the end of the reporting period, if you like, which is really this month. And the financial statement audit is progressing with NAO on that. And we also had a session with the NAO's Value for Money team which was useful just to understand where they were coming from, where they got to, and to feed in some thoughts around that. Very much that is still very much work in progress at the early stages in some respect of the work that's being done. A couple of times a year we have a session with Health Watch England, and that was good because I think we were seeing progress. Looking for Jane over there. Imelda Redmond, who's the new chief executive effective there, came to talk to us about things, and actually I think we saw a positive input coming through from that, and the Health Watch England's own audit committee is keeping a close eye on that. So those I think were the main points that I was going to draw out.
Paul, one thing I don't think we do is to ask you to convey back to colleagues that are on the audit committee that aren't sitting around this table what a great job they're doing. I mean, I occasionally come to your meeting as an observer, but I do also read all the minutes of the meetings and so on. And it's a very, very effective committee. So what you might do is just pass our thanks to, as I say, those of your colleagues that aren't around the table here.
Will do.
Thank you. Michael, the RGC, which met last night.
The Regulatory Governance Committee does deep dives into important areas of the CQC's work. And in fact, yesterday, the committee looked at an internal audit report on our ratings process, because internal audit produces reports, most of which are really the province of the committee that Paul has just described, but other reports are most relevant to the Regulatory Governance Committee. So yesterday we discussed the internal audit report on our ratings process, its strengths and weaknesses, and the way forward. And we had a very good attendance. I mean, all the members of the committee were present, but as well we had Mike Richards, Paul Elliott, we had representatives from each of the directorates, so we were able to have a very well-informed and full discussion of the report.
Which was positive. Just to make the point, it was a conclusion. Well, I mean, there was an overall conclusion, there were some issues, but overall it was positive, I think, report back. Good. Any other business from the board for this part of the meeting? Okay, so we've got only a few minutes, but we've got 5 minutes. So if there are any questions, members of the public, Robin, your hand went up very quickly. Would you like to go first? Come sit there, turn the microphone on, and then say who you are, even though we know who you are, and ask your question.
Thank you, Chairman. Robin Pike from Hertfordshire Health Watch. A couple of quick questions, if I may. One concerns prisons, and the other concerns possibly visits from board members to hospitals. There are, I think, now concerns about the prison service as a whole and the staffing. How has CQC found the medical services available in prisons, particularly for mental health?
Steve?
That's me, thank you. So part of the primary medical services directorate involves prisons and detention centres, and we have a comprehensive set of inspections in partnership with HMI Prison, all of which their reports are published on our website and on theirs. They come out as a joint report, so there's access to it. I haven't been pre-warned of the question, and if you want a summary across all the prisons in the country, then that would take some work, but certainly I've been on inspections of prisons as well, and they're variable, and we take it very, very seriously. But if there's anything specific you want to know, if you could send me an email, I'll give you a very detailed response and links to the reports. But we have a whole dedicated team that do prisons and detention centres, and having been on, I went to Felton Prison, and I thought the way they worked very well was very good with the HMI prison team. There's a lot of respect, a lot of mutual understanding, and of course we can take enforcement action, whereas the HMI prisons have a slightly different way of doing things, and it's symbiotic. It works very well.
And Robin, the part two of your question around visits?
Thank you, Chairman. This follows really from your March board meeting. The speed with which a hospital trust can move from being inadequate to a higher rating, particularly good. And this seems really quite variable in that some trusts have moved and remedied shortcomings quite quickly, whereas other hospital trusts have remained in special measures for, and do indeed still remain in special measures for some time. Now, I'm thinking particularly of the Barts Hospital Trust. I should declare that I'm a patient of the trust. The issues behind this movement from inadequate to a better rating seem to me not to be primarily financial, as that particular trust has had a lot of rebuilding, but more to do with the affective domain. And the question I'm asking you really is whether all board members might find it helpful to visit some hospitals and share the experience of outpatients who can find themselves at times sitting in a waiting area in a state rather of bewilderment, a little bit like Guildenstern perhaps, and try from the board's point of view to understand some of the issues which are challenging patients.
So, Mike, if you'd like to answer the sort of the more specific point about improvement and what happens and what doesn't, and then I might just answer the point about board members visiting providers.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, we now do have a small number of hospitals that have moved up 2 grades, if you like. So Hinchingbrook, Cambridge, Tameside, Morecambe Bay, for example, have gone from inadequate to good. University Hospital Bristol has gone from requires improvement to outstanding. And I think they should all be congratulated on that. In the particular case of Barts Health, which, as you will know, it is an enormous organisation. It includes Whipps Cross Hospital, Newham Hospital, Royal London Hospital, Barts Hospital itself. And it was very deeply in trouble in terms of both quality and finance. And we have seen improvement there, but not necessarily a whole grade change. And I think if you look at the ratings grids for Whipps Cross, for example, it remains inadequate, but there are fewer cells on the grid that are inadequate than there were before. And we will very shortly be publishing a report on Newham as well. So I think it is a super tanker. But I have definitely observed progress. I would, of course, like to see faster progress. All of us would, but there is progress there.
So every board member will shadow from time to time an inspection So all of us do get out and see for ourselves how our people are going about their job, but also during that process you do talk to both staff and patients. Personally, I do some of that. And indeed, to link back to your first question, I'm shadowing an inspection of a prison in a couple of weeks' time. And if I'm not at the May board meeting, you'll know they didn't let me out. The other thing I do, and I spend more time doing, is just going very informally, so not as part of one of our inspections, but to spend 2 or 3 hours with, it could be a care home, it could be a hospital, it could be a mental health trust, it could be general practice, it could be anything that we regulate. So that I can get in a different context, a personal feel for what's going on, what the challenges are, and the risk of embarrassing them. To give you an example, last week I went to Dorset County Hospital, a district general hospital, relatively small district general hospital, rated as requiring improvement. If you look at the inspection report, as last summer, Mike, I think, quite a long list of recommendations. And to your point about it not being money that was required to fix, I thought they were exemplary in what they were doing in taking our list of recommendations. That had become part of their board agenda, part of their quality committee agenda. They were working through. And their expectation, whether it turns out to be delivered or not, remains to be seen, of course, is that when we next inspect them, they will have addressed all the recommendations, and that should be sufficient to move them from requiring improvement to good. So I just thought that was an exemplary way of going about it. And to your point, these recommendations were not things that required huge amounts of money to fix. So, yeah, I think all my colleagues around the table spend time in different ways with different providers. So I hope that answers your question. We are sort of out of time. Was there anything, David, you've got 30 seconds to ask a question.
Well, my question...
Who are you, David?
I'm David Hogarth, and I come from Labour Care, St John's Wood and Maida Vale. My first question was to Michael Meyer, whether the Regulatory Governance Committee addressed the question of whether people assessing care homes for their elderly relatives can rely on the ratings given in adult social care, and in particular the ratings of a good rating in the caring domain, and I think I'll leave it at that. Actually, that's well within 30 seconds.
Very, very well done, David. I think it might be more appropriate if Andrea answers the question. I mean, what we had yesterday was a process talking about the assurance we were getting from the internal audit work. But Andrea, you were talking specifically about care homes. Would you like to answer the question?
Yes, although I wasn't at the meeting last night, my Deputy Chief Inspector for the North, Debbie Westhead, was there on my behalf, and I am aware that actually the Regulatory Governance Committee did indeed have a conversation about the assurance that they could take from the rating of caring, and challenged kind of me and my team through Debbie about that, and in some senses that's what the internal audit report was doing, was looking at what were our processes to ensure that there was consistency in the way that we were applying the key lines of inquiry around the question of caring, and also reflecting the characteristics of caring in the judgments that we were making. And I know that Debbie shared with you something that I've said before, which is that very often we are rating services, care homes and indeed domiciliary care services, and I think this is reflective across to the other two sectors as well. We are saying that caring is good, And what that generally is reflecting is the commitment and the dedication of the staff that we see working in services, sometimes in very difficult circumstances, but working in kind of doing that despite the system, not because of the system, and that actually our concern is how sustainable is that in terms of those members of staff being able to continue to work in that environment, able to continue to be caring when either the wraparound leadership or arrangements for safety or the numbers of staff that are on duty or the training and support that they get is not as sufficient as we would have liked it to be, and is the reason why other questions that we're looking at in terms of safety, effectiveness, responsiveness and well-led are not being rated as highly. And we know as well that there's significant turnover in adult social care services in terms of the numbers of staff who are changing. So it remains a concern, but I think that in terms of what my staff are doing, they are being consistent and we're following through a process, but I think that that's not to be complacent about the situation that members of staff in adult social care services are coping with out in the field.
Good. I'm sorry. We are really out of time. We've got quite a long afternoon ahead of us, board, so we need to end this session and have a short break, and then we start again after lunch. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you all, board.